When you think about giving birth, you think of a woman, and so it just made sense to them that whoever birthed the world was a woman.
I'm Mitch.
And I'm Missy.
We're co-workers.
He's the boss, and we're married.
And she's the boss. Together, we host Good Faith Weekly, a podcast on faith and culture.
What could possibly go wrong?
Tune in and find out. Missy. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up and tell you what we did at 10 o'clock on a Monday night this week. It was a lot of fun. And then later on the pod, Missy and I sat down with Reverend Kyndall Rae from Nevertheless She Preached. They have a conference scheduled for this September, and she talks about the book, or her latest book, the conference, and all. She's just a wonderful guest, and you're going to want to listen to that conversation. So stay tuned. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing quite well. Still a little hot under the collar, though.
I know, but our listeners are probably real tired of us griping about our air conditioning.
Actually, it's been pretty nice, I have to admit.
Yes, window units for the win.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, hey.
Yeah.
I want to talk to our listeners about something.
Okay, shoot.
I want to tell our listeners about something. We did something this week that we have not done in over 20 years.
This is a family show, Missy. You can't be airing all of our dirty laundry here.
If that's what you want to call it, that's fine. So we went to a 10 o'clock movie.
Not 10 o'clock in the morning, for those of you.
I was going to clarify because I feel like our demographic might wonder about that. No, 10 o'clock p.m.
Yeah, I mean, like
movie.
No sun, nothing. It was dark outside. It was weird.
Right. So it was super fun. We decided to go see the Barbie movie.
Yeah, I wore my pink. How about you?
No, I wore the sweats I was in when I left my office at 9:30 to leave for the movie.
Well, that checks out.
Were you aware that movie theaters have bars now?
You know, they're starting to creep up.
Was that a pleasant surprise?
It was a very pleasant surprise because I really wasn't certain what to expect, and I thought I might need a little loosening up to appreciate it more.
Well, if nothing else, sitting in a sold-out theater full of preteens at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night.
Yes.
I mean, that needed a little help.
Absolutely. In fact, there is a photo of us in the little, I don't know what you'd call that.
Like the photo booth.
Yeah, the photo booth there, Barbie. They're pretty cute.
We'll maybe post that. But anyway, so we went to see a 10 p.m. movie. We went to see the Barbie movie because we did want to be able to talk about it this week. And before we talk about the movie,
Jesus, there's a quiz coming.
Oh my gosh, no.
Thank God.
That would have been perfect.
Oh my gosh, no, that would have been terrible.
Should we stop now?
No.
All right, fine. So I want to tell a story of you and Barbie.
I dated a Barbie a long time ago, but you didn't know me then.
Oh, you did?
I did.
Okay. No, I want you to tell the story, and the audience is going to get to listen to me tell you how you're telling it wrong. This will be fun.
Oh, boy.
So remember back in the day when you were pastoring a church?
Yes.
Okay, so we had you had a children's sermon, and one of the things that you did that was really cool was you had, we've probably talked about it on the pod before, but you had what was called a mystery bag.
Yeah, I mean, it really wasn't a sermon because, pastors, to be honest with you, aren't really good at doing children's sermons.
Are you saying they're not great with kids? I don't know.
No, we're great with kids, but just that whole moment in the service gets kind of weird. And so instead of doing a sermon, we had time with Pastor Mitch.
Yes. And so we had some friends of ours here gave us a great idea, or gave you a great idea of the mystery bag. So
yes.
You had an old leather satchel from seminary days that you
still have it.
You still have it. So you gave it to the kids, and whatever kid had it that week would take it home and bring it back the next week with something inside, and you would have to.
Yep, because I would have no idea.
You had no idea what was coming. So
mystery bag.
This was the highlight of the adults. time in the service, right?
You could see all of the adults begin to edge to the front of their seats, awaiting what was coming out of that mystery bag.
So you would open the mystery bag and see what was inside it, and then the kid would like tell you, you'd ask questions while you're trying to figure out what in the world you're going to say about this object, because the whole point was that you were to make an object lesson out of whatever they brought that pertained to, faith, scripture, whatever, ideally the sermon that day.
Sure.
So there was, I will let you start the story, and I'll let you know when you tell it wrong. But there was a time where a little girl brought
a Barbie. And just to kind of set the stage, I mean, the kids did an incredible job. They were so creative, bringing special items in the mystery bag. Some, were sentimental to them, that had family roots to them. Others were just toys. There were live animals, actually. I
think Grandma's ashes maybe showed up.
It was crazy, all the things that they would bring.
We had a pregnancy announcement one time. There was a sonogram picture.
I think so, yes, absolutely. There was.
Lots of fun things.
So in this one occasion, this little girl brought her Barbie, and you could
so sweet.
Yeah, you could tell when I opened up the mystery bag and I pulled out that Barbie, her smile, she was just beaming with pride. She was so happy that she was on the stage. She was going to get to talk about one of her favorite toys. And so I pull it out and I immediately start trying to think of, how am I going to connect this Barbie doll with something spiritual? Exactly. Exactly.
Mary Magdalene, anyone?
I did. I mean, you wouldn't. I mean, if people could just see what was going through my mind each time I opened that bag and pulled something out, that would be gold.
Wait, it gets better.
It does get better. So I ask her, as I ask every child, to tell us a little bit about what she had brought in the mystery bag, which buys me some time to think about something to say.
Of course.
And so I asked her, tell us a little bit about this Barbie. And I thought, she's going to tell me about her hair, her eyes, her clothes, how much she plays with her, what kind of Barbie she is. But no.
Instead, she starts
undressing Barbie right before me, God, and the entire congregation. And she is still as proud as punch at this time. And she says, Pastor Mitch, look at this. Barbie
points her chest right
points
at you.
Her chest at me and says, look at this. Barbie has a camera. And at first I couldn't see the camera.
You had to look real deep.
That's when I think she actually pointed it at me and said, it's right here. And she was right under Barbie's breast.
In her cleavage.
There was a camera that I guess was hooked to some hard drive located inside the Barbie doll that took photos. I don't know if it took video, but it took photos. And she just points this thing out to me. Look, Pastor Mitch, it's a camera. And Barbie didn't have a stitch of clothes on. And I'm just sitting there with my mouth agape.
The audience loved this.
Oh my gosh. The congregation roared.
Figure out, what in the world do you do with an object lesson with a topless Barbie with a camera in her boobs? I'm not sure.
So when the anxiety began to dissipate and the squirrel slowed down in my brain, I came up with this.
Do you remember what you came up with?
Yes.
I don't.
I went with the camera motif and said, God is always there with us, watching over us.
God's always that creepy dude in the corner of your bedroom.
Now that I think back on it, maybe it wasn't that great of object lesson.
That is creepy. And I do now. I think I remember we did give you a little bit of hell about
that.
Yeah. Now that I think
a little bit.
Well, I mean,
between you and the choir and everybody else, it was crazy.
It was so funny. So last night, I don't know if you noticed, but one of the things that they did in the Barbie, I don't want to give any spoilers, but they did have some Barbie characters that were old discontinued Barbies, or Barbies that caused controversy, one of which was pregnant Midge. They kept kind of poking fun at. But one of the Barbies, I don't know if you realized it, had like a
No!
She did.
I didn't see her.
She did. And so I was like, oh my gosh, that Barbie's in the movie. I mean, it was a little bit different. They had a screen in her back instead of a camera in her boobs. But it was just really funny.
Oh my gosh, that is
That.
hysterical.
So I knew that I wanted you to retell that story. It's so appropriate because the Barbie craze, you guys,
It's yeah, it is crazy right now.
That, so tell me what you thought of the movie. Don't give any spoilers away, but
yeah, overall I thought it was really well done. The actors did a great job portraying the characters. I mean, good night. That had to be difficult portraying these iconic figures that have been around for decades. So I think they did a really good job with that. But what everybody is talking about is how this picture or this show, this movie, I don't know what the right vernacular is, but this movie tries to deconstruct the patriarchy. And I think overall, it does a really nice job of doing that and demonstrating how the patriarchy has affected culture and particularly oppressed women without people really even recognizing it.
Yeah, I know as a woman, which I don't know why that's still weird to say, but as a woman who grew up where I did, in the South, steeped in religious fundamentalism and patriarchy and all that, there are still some areas, even some in the movie, that they point out. I'm like, oh, duh. And I mean, it's still at my age. I'm like, I can't believe I'm just now seeing this behind the curtain for the first time. So there are those moments. I thought it was a good movie. I never thought I would be going to see a Barbie movie. Confession, was not into Barbies so much.
You were a Cabbage Patch Kid.
Well, Cabbage Patch Kids came later in the early 80s. And yes, my mom might have thrown a fist or two to get her hands on mine. May she rest in peace.
Yeah.
But no, my sister was into Barbies. And so therefore I, by default, we did have the 3-story townhouse with the elevator that
Braggart.
Santa brought. Oh, absolutely. We also had the very fancy high-end above ground swimming pool.
Wow.
It wasn't just the round
That's
one.
Impressive.
It was like the, kidney bean shaped one with the deck, and had a barbecue and little like hamburger patties and tongs. It had all the
Wow.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot more fun than the stick and tumbleweed that I had to play with as a kid.
Whatever. I've met your mother. That is not what you got for Christmas.
No, hand to God. I can remember I got the male version of Barbies. Got Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman,
Sure.
which was my favorite.
That was your favorite, right?
Yeah, still we
We
dress
need to
up for
unpack that someday.
yeah, we do. Still one of my favorites. But the one I can remember the most is the Lone Ranger and Tonto. And I always secretly wanted to be Tonto, but I knew that he wasn't the cool guy. It was a Lone Ranger.
And I know the reference, but I don't know enough to even make a joke about it because I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't even know those characters.
You don't know the Lone Ranger? I mean, with your Texas roots?
I do.
Yeah.
But not, there was a show, I assume.
Yes, there actually was. It was a book before it was a television talkie.
Okay, so then there were toys.
Yes, there were toys
Okay, so
associated.
I know of the Lone Ranger and Tonto,
Yeah,
but not much more than that.
Yeah.
So.
But overall, I thought it was good. I thought they did a good job, really bringing to light the dangers of the patriarchy. I also think what they did a really good job of, now that I reflect on it, is how the patriarchy also harms the male figures in the movie.
Absolutely.
And how the real patriarchy that's in our world, we're fighting it for equality for women, but we're also fighting it because of the harm it's doing to the males of our species.
So it really relates back to our conversation last week after we talked to Starlet about the new season of Raceless Gospel, which is another plug to go listen to that. About how racial identities and the human construct of race is not just harmful for those that are oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
It's harmful for everyone. And I feel like they did do a good job of that. You and I did talk afterwards about how we felt like the writing could have been a little bit better.
One of the things that was
don't send me hate, or better yet, send hate mail to Mitch at Good Faith Media.
You can send me hate mail, but more importantly, I want to kind of hear a question, because one of the things that I do get frustrated about, and I count myself as a feminist and an advocate for egalitarian systems and policies. But one of the things that I've grown a little bit weary of has been the portrayal of men as kind of the idiotic, bumbling fool in these movies. And I think they can make the point and deconstruct patriarchalism patriarchy is.
Wow,
I
you just coined that
coined a
term.
worm, didn't I?
Coined
a worm. I coined a worm.
That's what you did. Hey, Cliff, save that. He coined a worm.
They can dismantle the patriarchal system, but also, they don't have to just so demoralize men, because, and I understand that some of them need to be taken.
When you stereotype one,
but I think there's a lot of,
another.
Even in the movie theater, there was a lot of young men in the movie theater, and I wonder, does that inspire them to be, more egalitarian, or to just look at themselves as part of this horrible system? And I don't know. It's a hard. I'm not conveying it very well. I'm just interested in that facet of it, because it seems to be a running theme in a lot of these really, really good shows.
Maybe we will formulate some answers in the coming days to this, because you and I have been talking around and around about this, and it's one of those things where, like I talked about last week, when you come on this podcast and this platform and you start ad-libbing and you say things. And I feel like this is one of those times where I don't know. It's just hard to convey,
I don't really have an answer.
saying.
I don't have an answer to it. And I really am curious to hear from our listeners on this, because it does seem like it is a running theme in a lot of these shows that are trying to dismantle the patriarchy, and I'm all for it. But can we do that without just really deconstructing and destroying?
Well, you can deconstruct but not destroy.
Yeah.
Can we build? Is there a way to build everyone up?
Right. Can we lift everybody up, I guess?
So I just want to point out, as we pause to go to our interview, that if Mitch seems a little distracted as he's talking, in our unair-conditioned house, there is a fly.
Oh, I am being so dive-bombed by this fly.
It's been really tough.
I'm about to get my bow and arrow out and shoot this thing.
Focus on this conversation with his waving and flailing about trying to get this fly away. So anyways.
Well, speaking of dismantling the patriarchy, we had a wonderful conversation this week with the executive director of Nevertheless She Preached. They have a conference coming up in September. So you and I got to sit down with Reverend Kyndall Rae Rothaus and talk to her a little bit about Nevertheless She Preached and what's going on in the culture today when it comes to egalitarian views.
Yeah, she's wonderful. So I hope you enjoy the interview.
Have the last few years shifted your faith? I'm Brett Harris, and last year I walked away from the pulpit without a plan. I just knew where I wasn't where I was supposed to be. And I'd love for you to join me as I wander and wonder about faith and Scripture and how we can continue to follow Jesus' example even when our path forward is unclear. Find God Knows Where today in your favorite podcast app.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us all the way from Waco, Texas. Reverend Kyndall Rae Rothaus is a spiritual guide, preacher, poet, and feminist theologian. She often works with people on the margins of the church, and she is particularly interested in religious trauma, feminist spirituality, mystic traditions, and the intersection of systemic oppression and soul work. She has co-hosted the Discovering Wholeness podcast, part of the Good Faith Media podcast network, is a co-founder of Nevertheless She Preached, and is a prolific author. Her most recent book, The Kingdom Come, Breaking Free from the Patriarchy to Save Your Soul, is available for purchase and download. The Nevertheless She Preached conference is coming up this September, and you can register today at neverthelessshepreached.com. Kyndall, welcome back to Good Faith Weekly.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So, Kyndall, I'm not sure if you've heard or not, but at least in our neck of the geographic woods, there's kind of a lot of fodder right now about women in ministry.
No,
and
really?
we have pastors. I know, but
shocking.
I have my ear to the ground. I'm hearing the murmurings. I don't know about you. It's still baffling that this is even a thing we're talking about, or that we have to even give any attention to those who are continuing to question this. But we thought we should talk about it today and ask, what do you make of these conversations that are still happening in the SBC and in particular in Texas? Mm-hmm. Why are we still having them? What do we do? Do we look at it? Do we acknowledge it? Tell us.
Yeah. I am also seeing all sorts of stuff. It's all over my social media feeds and in my private conversations and public conversations. particularly as a Baptist, and I'm located in Texas, in response to the Southern Baptist Convention's recent statements about women in ministry. Anyone listening who doesn't know, the Texas Baptist Convention recently tried to put forward a motion stating that they support women pastors.
How'd that go?
Motion, I mean, I was not there. I no longer attend BGCT events, but it was amended to take out the word pastor, so that the BGCT now says that they support, I think it's something like women in leadership. I don't remember the wording they chose, but they specifically took out the word pastor. And then I've tried to spin that narrative as, look at us supporting women, rather than look at us refusing to call women pastors.
I'm sorry. I'm just so boggled by the reemergence of this. And I think the origin began when Rick Warren stepped down at Saddleback, and they ended up calling co-pastors one, which was a female, and the SBC lost their stuff. So they began kicking churches out. Some pastors made a list. So it reignited this conversation about women in ministry, women pastors, that filtered down to the state convention, as you mentioned, to go in Texas. Kyndall, why do some people just give women in ministry lip service, but do very little to advocate to put women behind pulpits?
Ooh, if I knew the answer to that, I think that it's much easier to say that you support something than to do the real work. And nobody, or very few people, want to appear anti-woman, and yet to actually give up power. I think that's what this is about. You have to give up power. You have to share it. You have to step down and decenter yourself if you're a man. And I think that it's that loss of power and control that keeps people from really doing the work.
Well said. Well, speaking of the patriarchy, Missy and I went to go see Barbie this week.
Yeah, I can't wait to see it.
So there is a lot of buzz.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. There's a lot of buzz about the movie as it calls out the patriarchy and the systems holding women back. Well, as we were watching the film this week, I could not help but think about your book and a sermon I heard you preach about how the patriarchal system oppressed the femininity of God. Now, can you quickly remind our audience about God's femininity, that it's rooted in theological history, and why it's so desperately needed today?
I love to talk about this. So there are quite a few references to God using feminine imagery in our scriptures, and in the Christian scriptures, which I can get to in a second. But what I really like to make sure people know about is that when you dig up like archaeological evidence from the first evidence we have of worshiping communities, so we're talking, pre-Christianity, pre-Abrahamic religions, the very first evidence we have of folks gathering together in some sort of worshipful environment, people first conceptualized of God as a female. And it actually made quite a bit of sense because early on in human history, people didn't have a scientific understanding of procreation and weren't really aware that men had much to do with it. So when you think about giving birth, you think of a woman. And so it just made sense to them that whoever birthed the world was a woman. And also some of the first instances of worship were about revering ancestors, and people trace their ancestry through their mother line. So, they were the child of their mother who was the daughter of the grandmother, and on and on and on, tracing your great grandmothers. And so if you tried to imagine some sort of supreme ancestor that was worthy of reverence, you would have been tracing that lineage through the mothers to the great 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 grandmother.
That really makes so much sense.
Yeah, right.
Sorry, go on.
And so and what's interesting then is if you trace history, there's this sort of shift, right, for religion to start revering God as a masculine figure. But it wasn't like just some natural, organic shift that happened. It was this violent suppression of anything to do with goddesses. And we even see evidence of that in our Bibles, like during the Canaanite conquest, when the Israelites are coming in and stamping out any of the indigenous religion, and Asherah poles and all that sort of thing, that it was really a violent act of trying to eliminate any imagery of God that was feminine in nature. And so the patriarchal religion that we have inherited was birthed in violence. It came from violence. And I think it's so important to understand that piece of our history, and then also to then look at scripture and that to see that even despite all of that violence, we still have these glimmers of God being compared to a mother hen, or God, being a mother who's nursing an infant, or God being a mama bear, or, there's these, it's still poking through even despite all that suppression, which I actually think is quite beautiful.
As you were talking and just reflecting back upon the movie and about your book and the sermon I heard you preach, recently I've been attempting to get to know my Native American heritage, my indigenous culture much better. And so trying to understand my forefathers and foremothers' religious beliefs, their cultural understanding about how the world came into being, origin stories and that such. And it's fascinating to me, if you look at other indigenous religions, a lot of the origin stories and the theological constructs have this very strong feminine presence within them. The earth giving birth to humanity or to nature. I even think about, even more recently in indigenous cultures, land ownership was through women and not through males. And it's just very interesting to see how other cultures, especially indigenous tribal cultures, how that was a point of conflict when the white Anglo colonial culture shows up and conquers these indigenous cultures, bringing the patriarchy with them. So it's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So you kind of touched on a few of the instances in biblical text about the femininity of God. And I remember also hearing you preach and kind of, again, those things I guess you knew were there, but didn't really know were there. I was wondering, you kind of touched on a couple. If you would give us a couple more examples of places that we're not necessarily seeing that, like you bring up in your sermon.
Honestly, my favorite place to go, because everyone actually does know this passage, is simply the creation story, when God is creating man and woman, and God states very clearly, I am creating them in my image. So, male and female. And so logically, that means men and women both have something to show us about the image of God. And yet we somehow have developed this idea that God is male, which means we're cutting off half of that image of God. So to me, that's a really obvious one that we overlook all the time. There are some passages in Hosea that talk about God bending over to feed God's people. And the image there is so clearly a breastfeeding image, for example. But I think when you just have it in your mind that God is male, it's easy to just read over a passage like that and not even see that it's describing breastfeeding, because that's just not how you think of men. So there are passages like that, that I think are also obvious if you're paying attention, but if you've been conditioned not to see that, then it doesn't even enter your awareness.
I think that's the important point that you just mentioned, is that we've been so conditioned not to see things that are just so obvious and are, there. And even like Mitch mentioned in seeing the movie last night, it was just, there were some things even in this somewhat silly Barbie movie that's just like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. How could I not have ever seen this thing that's so clearly happening? I don't want to give any spoilers away, but let's talk for a minute about Nevertheless She Preached. One element of the Nevertheless She Preached mission that seems unique is your emphasis on elevating female, queer, and BIPOC voices. Why is it essential to include the queer and BIPOC voices in your stated mission?
Because I think it's so important that we understand that feminism from an intersectional lens. Because if we don't understand the ways that everybody's different oppressions are linked and intersecting, then we just end up with this version of white feminism that causes more harm than good. We're just sort of laser focused in on the experiences of white women and presenting them as if a white woman's experience is everyone's experience, when actually white women, particularly straight, cisgender white women, they experience both oppression and privilege, and don't fully understand the experiences of what it's like to be a queer woman or a woman of color. And so at NSP, we're really, we're not perfect, but we're trying really hard to address the intersections of people's identity and experiences, and center the voices of people who live their life on the margin in a variety of ways, not just as women.
And that's what I really appreciate about Nevertheless She Preached, Kyndall, is that you have this theological construct. The organization has this theological construct. We're going to talk about the theme of this year's conference here in a second, Elevate Women's Voices. But this construct of the femininity of God and feminism at large. But it's not the only thing that is discussed at these conferences. Mm-hmm. While that is an overarching text, what's being discussed is some really incredible theological constructing by women, by queer pastors, by women of color, that while there's always that tinge of the femininity there, they're also talking about very important theological issues. And I think that's one of the things that we get lost in when we talk about women preachers or women in ministry. That's all we want to talk about. But the reality is there's so much more that can be added to the discussion. We miss out when we don't have these voices in the public square and in the church. And perfect example for me, I have been looking for a long time for a new theological construct outside of the one that my tradition. Mm-hmm. And last year's conference had Lenore 3 Stars. Mm-hmm. And she talked about the theology of wholeness.
Yeah.
And that just enraptured me. And I've been thinking about it and writing about it for an entire year, because I was put in this conference put me in this space with Lenore that I could hear that type of theology being espoused. In fact, I've got a meeting with her this week to talk more about it. So I just love the conference itself and what it does, not only to promote women voices, but also to promote women voices talking about a breadth of issues.
Yeah, I'm so excited to hear that impacted you in that way. And it leads me back to that question you asked at the beginning about why do some people give all this lip service to women in ministry? And I think it often boils down to a kind of tokenism of, we want to highlight a few women over here kind of on the side, but we don't actually want to overhaul our theological construct. We don't actually want to reform our whole approach to church. And so what ends up happening is this tokenism where one or two women who are deemed appropriate, get given a platform or a pulpit or, their picture on the flyer or whatever. But all these other voices are still being silenced and suppressed, so that no real transformation has to happen. And so that is a way in which I think the patriarchy just is able to train a few women to prop up their cause, instead of allowing women and other marginalized voices to completely flip the script.
Yeah. And that brings me to the conference itself. This year's theme, as I mentioned a moment ago, is elevating women's voices, which is so important. Kyndall, why is that needed right now more than ever? And tell us about the voices that we're going to hear when we sign up for the conference in September.
So Elevate has been an important theme for us from the beginning, and our tagline is actually Elevate, Liberate, Transform. And I think we're unique among Christian conferences in that we don't just include marginalized voices, but they are front and center the entire time. So we actually don't have any men who speak at our conference. We have lots of men who attend, and I'm so grateful for them. But it's really a chance to come and listen and sit at the feet of these voices that are often suppressed or dismissed or talked over, and give them the mic, give them the megaphone, give them the platform, so to speak. And it's so freaking important right now. I actually had a very harrowing weekend this weekend. I was at the hospital for multiple hours with a friend whose daughter we believe was molested. And it was gut-wrenching. And I was sitting there thinking about our political climate, and both religiously and secularly, and the people who are going after women ministers, the people who are going after trans kids. And yet here I am sitting here with this mom and her very young child that has just been abused by a white guy who is a part of this system we have created where men get so much power and are not held accountable for their actions. And that is the world that needs changing. That is the fight that needs fighting. And yet we're out there doing it we're just causing harm, rather than addressing the real root of the issue. And the sexism that plagues our country makes us so ripe for rape and assault and abuse, particularly against women and children. And so I'm just a big believer that this matters.
Yeah, sure.
It matters deeply.
That's next year's theme, right?
That's right. It's going to be a t-shirt. This matters.
It matters, yeah.
If you don't take it, we will.
And we just have to create a different world for our kids. We just have to, you know? And so, Speaking of the political climate this year, I'm really excited because, there's been so much anti-trans legislation happening all across the country. So we were like, we cannot host NSP this year and not have a drag queen. So
you signed Mitch up, right?
So we have Lainey Grant.
I saw that
coming this year.
Yeah,
fantastic.
So excited. Their work is fantastic. So they're performing on Monday night. And they do a lot. They write a lot of their own music and will be performing live. So it's not just lip syncing. It's going to be a whole concert. We have LaVon Briggs coming this year. She is the author of the book Sensual Faith. Sensual Faith. Yeah. She's going to be preaching for us as our opener. We have, as usual, we have a great lineup. We also have the Reverend Naomi Washington Leaphart, who is a queer Black womanist scholar and theologian who's going to be speaking. Dr. Paige Rawson, who is a queer, non-binary spiritual leader. It's just going to be a fantastic group of folks talking with us. And we've also redesigned our model a little bit this year so that there's going to be more room for conversation and hearing from the wisdom that's in the room with us, not just the folks up on stage. So I'm also really excited about that dynamic. And then we also have some award-winning poets who are going to be performing spoken word poetry. That is most of that happens on Sunday night, and people who haven't been to that kind of event before, they always leave and they're like, what just happened? These poets are phenomenal. It is an art form, and it rips you open and stitches you back up all at the same time. So we just have a lot that is packed into there that I'm really excited about.
Well, we're really excited about attending. Good Faith Media will be there. We'll be exhibiting there, be covering the conference in its totality, and just so excited to be there. And it's going to be in Austin, Texas. I assume
Yes.
you're going to cool or turn the air conditioning on before we get there.
Yes.
Because I hear it's hot in Texas right now.
It is very hot, but the conference will be inside. Okay. We'll have refreshments.
Right. And where can people go to register, Kyndall?
Yeah, they can go to neverthelessshepreached.com. And if you're local, you can actually, and you can't come to the whole thing. We have, you can come just Monday, you can come just Tuesday. But we also have people who come from all over the country and even Canada. So it's definitely worth flying in for and coming to the whole thing if you can make it.
Well, Kyndall, thank you so much for being our guest this week on Good Faith Weekly. But before we let you go, we always have one question that we ask our guests. And so, Missy, take it away.
Well, Kyndall, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of our conversation today and the work that you do, what is your more to tell?
What's coming up for me is the more of around how NSP started, which is so we were founded 6 years ago in 2017. And it actually came out of this response to a lack of female representation in Baptist seminaries and circles. And we're an ecumenical group. We're not a Baptist affiliated organization. But my colleague and I were both Baptist pastors, and my colleague and I who founded NSP, Natalie Webb, and we were going through many of the same conversations that are happening again today, with just the frustration. And so it was interesting because the seminary, we just got tired. We had asked so many times that of our seminary, our alma mater, to please have more women's voices present. And we kept being given this answer of, oh, yeah, that's very important. That's very important. And then no change, like all semester long, they'd have one or two women preaching in chapel. And so we finally decided to just create our own event and do our own thing, like stop waiting on institutional approval, just make it happen. a lot of cool stuff happens when women get fed up, I've learned. And so we decided to put together this conference, but we're two full-time pastors, really busy with our own lives. We don't have a budget. We don't have a venue. We just have this idea. And we start putting together this conference, and our friend Heather Mooney made our shirts that say "Nevertheless She Preached," and the she is made up of the names of women who've preached throughout history. And we started selling T-shirts to raise money, and in 5 weeks, we sold $20,000
Wow.
worth of T-shirts. And so we were shocked. We thought we were kind of responding to this local Waco Baptist situation, but there were people buying these shirts all across the country. They got talked about in the Washington Post article. It became this thing, and we realized, oh my gosh, like we are striking a chord for women and other marginalized folks across the country. And so I think the more to tell is that no matter how isolated you might feel as a woman or a marginalized person right now, you are not alone. You are so not alone. And so that's what NSP is trying to do, is bring some of us who are feeling that isolation together, so that we can support one another and encourage one another and learn from one another and inspire one another. And that's what we learned when we started this movement, is that there were thousands, and thousands of us with similar experiences.
Well, Kyndall, once again, thank you so much for being a guest this week on Good Faith Weekly. You can find out more about Kyndall and the Nevertheless She Preached conference at neverthelessshepreached.com. Kyndall, it's always a joy. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, Missy, it's always a joy to have Kyndall on the show. I always learn something from her. She's insightful, she's thoughtful, and inspirational.
She really is. I remember, I listened to her sermons, before I met her. Mm-hmm. I remember pulling those up online and listening. I love her insight. I do remember the first time I heard her in person, I think was the first time I ever heard an entire sermon on the femininity of God.
Yeah, that's great.
So, I kind of asked her some questions about that as well, because it was really, not mind-blowing, because you hear kind of the story of, as you grow up, oh yeah, there's femininity of God because, you gather your chicks like a mother hen, and that's really all you ever hear.
Right.
And there's so many more instances biblically to point to that, which is just, we did not get exposed to any of that language societally. And I say that, I know like a biblical view is in terms of the globe is not a majority view or whatever, right. But it was still our world.
Yeah. We grew up in a system. Both of you, we grew up in similar systems that was steeped in the patriarchy, that the man was the ruler of the church as well as at the home. And that's just kind of the context in which we grew up. But then all of a sudden we began to encounter other perspectives. And for me specifically, it was in that fall first semester at seminary when I heard Dr. Boo Heflin talk about egalitarianism, and he dared use the Bible to make his point. And it just blew my mind. And I began to see the feminine side of God in scripture, in historical theology, in culture today. And it was just, my mind was opened finally to this incredible insight that I just didn't grow up with.
It's funny because, to quote the great prophet of the pod, Moira Rose,
yes,
when she says, sometimes the eye won't allow the brain to see things at first.
True. Amen.
And I just keep finding myself going back there as we're unpacking and deconstructing worldviews that we were so ingrained and we were entrenched in. But yet at the same time, like I opened up in the beginning of the interview asking Kyndall about, and you and I have talked about this offline, of why are we still having conversations about women as pastors or women as preachers, women in ministry? it's baffling to me.
I still don't think we understand the breadth and power that these systems that we grew up in exert over our lives and the way we think, the way we believe, the way we act and relate to one another, is really just mind-blowing if you begin to think about it, because it starts at an early age. We start social conditioning very, very early. Now, we can talk about the differences in biology between male and female and non-identifying genders, but
that socialization.
But the socialization begins so early.
So, well, and to clarify, when I say why are we still talking about this, it's not because I don't want to talk about it. It's just that this is still an issue, is what is so frustrating for me. That we are still giving microphone, we are still giving airtime to organizations, to individuals who speak out against, an egalitarian view.
Yeah, well,
I don't understand. That's what's frustrating to me. So just let me clarify that point.
Yeah, 100%. Dr. King addressed that in his letter to the Birmingham, or out of his letter from the Birmingham jail, when he talked about those in power have never given up that power willfully. The oppressed and marginalized have always had to fight for it and demand it. And it's taken a long journey for some of those rights to emerge. And I see that as a continuing fight, not only for racial justice in this country, but also for egalitarian views and theological constructs in this world, because this is the system that we have, and we have been living under this system not for 200 years, but for thousands of years.
And some of the, what you talked about towards the end of the interview about Nevertheless She Preached in particular, is how much you've enjoyed attending and hearing from voices that are underrepresented or that are oppressed, but not just about, they're not just about one topic.
Yeah,
they talk about a wide variety of topics.
And I'm so glad you asked Kyndall that question in the interview, because I think that is one thing that we do fall into a trap, and understandably so. We end up asking the Black theologian questions that only pertain to Black theology or Black issues. The same can be said for our gay and lesbian friends and colleagues, our transgender friends. But they have so much more to say and to add to the overall conversation. And the story I told about last year's conference and being able to listen to Lenore 3 Stars talk about a theology of wholeness against the backdrop of the theology of colonialism, that blew my mind and is still blowing my mind today.
You keep talking about it.
And I am so giddy, and I will report next week, but I have a Zoom call with Lenore this week to talk about her helping me understand a theology of wholeness more thoroughly than I do right now.
But much like, we have, to give another example, we have a transgender friend who says, I have more to offer than just
100%.
This thing, that I am more of a person. I am a deep thinker. I am a theologian. I am, all of these things. That's what we are, by continuing to allow voices in the arena who believe in the oppression of people for one reason or the other, we are limiting the wholeness of those who are oppressed, of those who have more to say. And yes, we want to learn about, the construct of race. We want to learn about gender, and we want to learn about all of these things, but we want to know people on a deeper level. And if we could get past it, some of these other issues and hangups, how much more could we be gleaning from?
Yeah. And that's why I really enjoy having conversations with people like Kyndall, attending conferences like Nevertheless She Preached, because I get to hear this diversity of voices talk about a diversity of issues. And I grow not only as a person of faith, but as a person. just trying to understand more and to learn more to help myself, in Lenore's words, become more whole.
Absolutely.
Well, we appreciate you tuning in this week. Go check out Nevertheless You Preached at their website. Register for the conference in September down in Austin. It's going to be a good time. Stop by our booth when we show up there in Austin. Love to see you down there. So it's been a good week, Missy.
Absolutely.
Well, until next week, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.